And welcome everyone. My name's Michael Buckland. I'm the CEO of the McKell Institute, and it's a pleasure to have you here today. I wanted to start by recognising the traditional owners of the land. Here at the McKell Institute, we are on Gadigal land of the Eora Nation. One of the great pleasures of side effects of these Zoom meetings over the last year has been to interact with people on many different lands. And it is a reminder that of the diversity of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in Australia. So we recognise their elders past, present and emerging and pay our respects. In June 2015, the McKell Institute released a paper called Baby Steps, Giant Strides. And in it, we kicked off what became 6 years of work in early childhood education. Our focus has always been on encouraging economic participation and easing costs of living pressures. Just last week, the Productivity Commission released their figures that showed that 1/3 of people who are not in the workforce cite childcare as the major reason for that. But one of the reasons we're really excited about today is that we know that that is just one small part to play. And so we're thrilled to be joining with Thrive by Five, who have brought together so many voices for reform in the childcare sector for this virtual summit, the McKell Institute Thrive by Five Virtual Summit on Early Childhood Education. In a moment, I'm going to pass over to the Honourable Jay Weatherill, CEO of Thrive by Five and former Premier of South Australia, and he will be facilitating our keynote panel discussion with a panel of that bring extraordinary expertise from a diverse sector, including Michele O'Neil, President of the ACTU, Lucy Turnbull, businesswoman, philanthropist and former Chief Commissioner of the Greater Sydney Commission, Georgie Dent, CEO of the Parenthood, and Mohammed Al Kaavaji, CEO of the Federation of Ethnic Communities Council of Australia, bringing a voice that is often left out of these debates. Following the panel, we will break into a series of breakout discussions in various breakout rooms, where our panelists will be joined by Danielle Wood, from CEO of the Grattan Institute, Olga Rastregia from the Directorate of Employment, Labour, Social Affairs at the OECD, Mary Delahunty from HESTA, Susan Metcalf, CEO of Chief Executive Women, and our very own chair of the McKell Institute, Craig Emerson, as well as our Victorian Executive Director, Ryan Batchelor. So thank you all for joining us. One final note on housekeeping. This is a recorded session, and so please make sure you keep your comments respectful because we'd like to be able to share it publicly. We encourage you to keep your video on. It makes it a little bit more interactive and a lot more fun for the speakers. Please include your name and the organisation you're coming from in your Zoom name so that you can participate fully. Other than that, if you have any technical issues, please reach out to our tech support team, which will be working backstage, and you can do that through posting your comments in the chat. If you have any questions, just post your questions in the chat as well. And meanwhile, I will hand over to Jay Weatherill. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Michael. And it's wonderful to be joining you today. I come to you from Whadjuk country here in Perth. And it's a great thrill, actually, to be partnering with the McKell Institute in what is a really important public policy issue. And I think if there is an upside to what we've been experiencing over the last year or so, it's the way in which we've been able to come together in these really rich policy discussions about things that really matter. Thrive by Five is a campaign that tries to bring together many voices from across a very broad cross-section of the community that are interested in the early years, but really with one message. And that one message is to push for reform of our early years system so that we do have a high quality, universally accessible early learning system for every child and family in this country. So that's our purpose. And what we're trying to do is to foster public debate, which puts this on the national political agenda. And I think momentum is really building around that. And we're just so thrilled to be here today with such a stellar group of speakers. What I'm going to do is introduce each of the speakers in a moment. And they'll give a brief set of introductory remarks. And hopefully that will assist you to think of some questions you might want to put to them, and then we'll go to an open session. And a little bit later, there'll be a breakout session where you can go in and have a more intimate discussion with a range of other people that will be collaborating in bringing that discussion to you. But the first person I want to introduce, of course, is Michele O'Neil. Michele is president of the ACTU. I first knew and met her when she was secretary of the Textile Clothing and Footwear Union, and was always a powerful and articulate advocate. It's no surprise that she's risen to the top of the trade union movement. I'm told she began working life as a waitress and then went on to work in the community sector with homeless young people, and then on to the clothing sector. So she's certainly experienced the workforce from every element. So it's fantastic that she's such a powerful advocate for working people. And Michele, could you give us some introductory remarks?
Thanks, Jay, for those generous words. And hi, everyone. I want to begin also by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that I'm on today. It's the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and want to pay my respects for their elders past and present, and always was and always will be Aboriginal land. And thanks to the McKell Institute and Thrive by Five, and also my fantastic fellow panellists I'm looking forward to hearing from. I also want to begin by acknowledging the role that early childhood educators have played throughout COVID-19. They've seen loss of hours, loss of jobs and pay. They've been on the front line caring and educating for our children. They've had to deal with unknown risk, but they kept showing up. They were dealing with fearful children and fearful parents, and often unclear and contradictory policies from the government. So one minute they were a hero, and the next minute they were the only sector singled out to be prematurely cut off from JobKeeper support. So all credit and respect to Australia's early childhood educators. And the Australian Trade Union movement, as we moved through COVID-19, realised that as well as the role we were playing in dealing with the health crisis, we also had a job to do in helping develop a comprehensive national economic reconstruction plan. And a key component of that plan is our early childhood education and care strategy. And that has something that's been really well supported across every union in our movement. And we understood that in reconstructing our national economy after COVID-19, and in particular repairing the employment prospects for women workers, that we needed a strategy to roll out high quality, publicly funded, not-for-profit childcare, preschool and early learning services. And we did this because, you know, economic studies have shown that government investment in early childhood education and care literally pays for itself. Once you take into account the additional output and taxes that come about from women's increased labour force participation. And women's labour force participation in Australia is far below rates in comparable industrial countries. If Australian women between the age of 25 and 45 participated in the labour market as much as men do, the economy would benefit from 475,000 potential new workers, and we'd get an enormous boost to economic growth, government revenues, and of course, family incomes. If those women were working, Australia's GDP would be $70 billion per year higher, and family incomes would be boosted by $30 billion a year. Early childhood education also provides children with so many significant educational benefits, helping to improve their quality of life, their employment options, income and health as they grow older. And it's those first 5 years where our brain develops more and more quickly than any other time in our life. And it's when we learn to socialise, to cooperate and to communicate. So universal access to early childhood education and care is essential, not just to increase women's participation in the workforce, but also to better the lives of future generations of children. And workers in this sector do some of the most important work that anyone could do. 97% of them are women. We entrust these workers with our babies and our children, but at the same time, we undervalue the work and we fail to provide secure, well-paid jobs. Central to improving early childhood education is bringing about a fundamental reassessment of the importance of this work, lifting the recognition and pay of the workers in the sector, and ensuring we create secure, long-term, sought-after careers for them. Our early childhood educators are some of the absolute heroes of the pandemic, but at the start of 21, they're exhausted. They're overworked, they're underpaid, and many are also leaving the profession that they love. They love their work, but increasingly they've had enough. And that's why centres are now having so much trouble holding on to and recruiting staff in this sector. Many of them are barely paid above the minimum wage. It's an awful irony that our early childhood educators, people who love educating and caring for young kids, often don't ever earn enough to send their own kids to childcare. We need to treat educators with respect. They deserve decent wages and job security. They deserve reasonable workloads, and they deserve clear career paths. And while the gender gap is slowly being closed in parts of the world, it's barely improved in Australia over the last 25 years. On average, employed women earn almost 1/3 less per week than employed men. And women retire today with just half the superannuation of men. So we strive to teach our kids about fairness from day one, yet try telling the girls that they could earn 30% less than the boys. Never mind the pub test, it wouldn't pass the kinder test. And free and universal childcare can help close that gap substantially. The second biggest cause of that gap in Australia, according to KPMG, is the career breaks that women take to look after their children. And the longer they're out of work, the harder it is to get back into work. And that's why the pandemic is likely to have made the gender pay gap worse, as women took on even more caring responsibilities. So free and universal childcare would give women so much more control over getting back into the workforce or taking on more hours. And properly valuing the work of our educators, who are nearly all women, as I said, by paying them a fair wage, would make a significant contribution to narrowing that gap. So our early childhood and care strategy has got several components. It's got the provision of permanently free childcare for all Australian families, capital investment to construct new high quality, publicly funded, not-for-profit childcare facilities, the funding of universal access to 15 hours of preschool for 3 and 4-year-olds, and increasing funding that is linked to better wages for the educators. To have those wages set at a level that delivers pay equity for early childhood educators. And that should be relative to the value of equivalently skilled workers in male-dominated industries. Is there any reason in Australia in 2021 why we value the work of an engineer or an electrician more than an early childhood educator? So the provision of appropriately funded free childcare would boost the disposable income of households with young children, and it would actually provide a really important stimulus to consumer spending. And as we know, that's key to the recovery and would improve overall demand in the economy. So we reckon constructing a quality, accessible, publicly funded, not-for-profit early childhood and care, education and care system holds really outstanding potential to contribute to Australia's post-COVID reconstruction. It's going to be a highly effective job stimulus in the short term. It's got the capacity to boost long-term labour force participation and economic growth. It literally pays for itself, as I said, via tax revenues and increased employment and production of parents. And it will make life-changing differences to our children who benefit from the education and care. So really, we reckon the question isn't why has the Australian trade union movement got a plan to rebuild the economy, which has a central focus on early childhood education and care. It's why doesn't the federal government? Thanks, Jay.
Thanks, Michelle. Fantastic. Our second speaker has played a critical role in putting the early years on the national political agenda. Georgie Dent is the Executive Director of the Parenthood, a journalist, editor, author, MC, facilitator, and an incredibly effective advocate in this area. We remember her hashtag Credible Woman trope, which managed to, as she was dismissed as no credible person would be holding this position, she managed to respond with that, and that became quite a online sensation. So thank you, Georgie. If you could just give us some opening remarks.
Yeah, thanks very much, Jay. I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, and for me here in Sydney, they are the Camaragal people of the Eora Nation. I would also like to acknowledge the terrific speakers that I'm here alongside today. It's still sort of, I just can't quite get over the momentum that we have got around this issue at the moment. And I'm here really to give the perspective of parents in Australia and how they are experiencing the early education and care system as it is. And I often give context to my interest in advocacy in this area. And it is because I am a white, middle-class, incredibly privileged person. I mean, except for possibly if I was a man, I have almost every privilege that a person can have. And I became very interested. I also grew up in a family that was a little bit unusual. And I'm actually disappointed because there is someone logged onto this call whose title says grandmother, but I actually think mother should come first because she's my mum. And I feel like her taking ownership of the grandkids ahead of me isn't really fair. But anyway, I grew up in a house where mum and dad had a very equal partnership. My dad is a dentist, mum was a speech pathologist. They shared everything. And I grew up in a home where I genuinely thought that that's how the world operated. And when I left, I went to university, I did business and law. And at uni, I was also convinced that Australia was a very fair place. There were certainly as many females in my course as there were men. There were slightly more females. But of course, when I came into the workforce, I recognised there was this, chasm between men and women. And as I looked further up the chain, it got bigger and bigger. And I started my career as a lawyer. I didn't last very long, and I wrote a book about that if you're interested in reading it. But I ended up moving into journalism, and I was a business journalist, which gave me the opportunity to ask a lot of questions about why a country like Australia that educated women and girls the way that it did, how could we be a country that had this huge gap between men and women? And particularly as a business journalist, I was looking at the representation of women in senior roles, in universities, in businesses, in government. And, the lightning bolt moment for me in coming to understand exactly why there was this gap was when my husband and I had our first child. Obviously, having a child is a huge adjustment, but for us, childcare was one of the first barriers that made it so clear why Australia did have this huge gap between men and women. My husband and I both live and work in Sydney, but our parents don't live there. So we didn't have the capacity for grandparents to help out with childcare. And the only service that we could find for our daughter was $165 a day, and it was in the CBD. Now, I didn't work in the CBD and my husband didn't work in the CBD, but we would catch the bus into the CBD with our little, 1-year-old and drop her off 4 days a week. And I realised in the middle of an interview that I thought we were going to be okay financially, because at the time there was a subsidy that was expressed as a 50% subsidy. So it was $165 a day, but we were going to be okay if it was 50%. And I was actually doing an interview on the issue of childcare when someone said to me that subsidy runs out at $7,500. So I literally got off the phone, panicked, and called my husband, and I was like, this is an absolute disaster. We absolutely cannot afford this. And so that year we spent $27,000 on childcare. Now, again, I'm incredibly privileged, so is my husband. This was 11 years ago. Neither of us had a particularly great wage, but we knew we had potential. And we were able to, because we knew we had that potential, we were able to hold on and think things are going to get better. It got a lot worse before it got better because we had another child. So there was a long period of spending a crazy amount of money on childcare. But that showed me so clearly that this was a system that was broken, because we had so many reasons to persevere. But I could see that lots of people would not have reasons to persevere. Frankly, getting on a bus with a toddler once a week is probably enough to put you off making that decision, but doing it 8 times every week is really something else. And when you're doing it and you're effectively paying to go to work, it's easy to see why families make these choices. And I really do want to emphasize that when I give that example, I know how lucky I am. And I know that we were so privileged to be able to make that decision. But I learnt so quickly how broken it was. And I started talking about it and I started writing about it. And 11 years on, I haven't stopped. And I'm now in a job which is amazing because I run the Parenthood, which is a not-for-profit advocacy organisation representing parents. And I am really optimistic about being able to help drive this key reform, because affordability is a huge issue for families. We know that. Australian families do pay some of the highest fees in the world for early education and care. And just in the last month, we've had a number of really troubling releases and information published that shows this is going to get worse. The Education Department is expecting fees to rise 4.1% each year for the next 4 years. And we're coming from a very high starting point. And we're coming from a point where in 2017, the Hilda study asked families how they were coping with childcare, and 49% said they were struggling to meet the cost. That was in 2017, so that's before the fees have increased to the point they are now. That was when the economy was still booming and we didn't know what COVID was, and we hadn't heard of it. I mean, we'd heard of a pandemic, but it was a far away proposition. That families are not in a position to absorb these increases in fees, and we know what decisions they make when that's the situation. They decide that one person can't work, and we know that generally that person who doesn't work is going to be the woman, because women tend to earn less to start with. We've got really inadequate paid parental leave in Australia, which also puts families into a situation where one person earns and one person cares. And then they get into the situation where childcare is so expensive. And even aside from the cost issue, which is really significant for so many families, the other issue that we've got is that we don't have as many young people enrolled and participating in early education as we should. So we know that between 0 and 5, what happens in a child's life is so richly formative. But in Australia, we lag OECD countries when it comes to the participation of 3 and 4-year-olds in particular. And what is most alarming is that the children in those age groups who aren't attending are the most vulnerable. And we know that a child with any disadvantage or vulnerability in their background are the children that stand to benefit the most from attending early education and care. And so we have got two issues here, that we haven't got enough children attending, and we haven't got families being able to make the decisions they need to make when it comes to work and care. So that's my opening remarks.
Thank you, Georgie. And now, before I introduce my next speaker, I just want to remind you that there's a chat function here. So drop your questions into the chat function, and what will happen is we'll take you off mute and you can ask those questions yourself. Or if you want me to ask the question on your behalf, happy to do that. So just start thinking about that over the next couple of speakers. Now, our next speaker is Lucy Turnbull. Lucy was acknowledged through being awarded an Officer of the Order of Australia in 2011 for her extraordinary work over an extended period of time as the first female Lord Mayor of the City of Sydney from 2003 to 2004, and also in a range of contributions in her interest as an urbanist in cities and in technological and social innovation, and her significant contribution to public policy in this country. So thank you very much for joining us, Lucy. I'm very much looking forward to your opening remarks.
Thank you, Jay, and thank you for asking me. And like Georgie and Michelle, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land where I am now, which is Gadigal land, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. So I'm going to actually make very similar points to the points that Michelle has made and Georgie has made. I'm not going to repeat them, but I'm going to make the same points from another direction. And I was asked when sent the speaking notes to approach my perspective on childcare and early learning through a business person's perspective. And, you know, in any business, particularly labour-intensive ones, and childcare must be one of the most labour-intensive businesses or enterprises, not-for-profit or otherwise, you could possibly engage in. The critical determinant of whether you have a successful enterprise in terms of fulfilling the objectives of the enterprise to look after children is having a good workforce, a great human capital, good human resources, and low staff turnover. Now, we know that there are very high levels of staff turnover in the childcare, amongst child carers, and to a slightly lesser extent on the part of early childhood teachers. And why do we think that might be? Well, I think it's really highlighted if you do the comparison between the value that childcare workers and teachers provide to society for the reasons that Michele and Georgie so cogently put to us, and the cost of that human capital. So let me just run quickly through some comparisons. A childcare worker, I'm getting this info from a government website called www.jobsoutlook.gov.au. Childcare workers with Cert 3 training have an average pay per week of $953. Now, they're defined to have medium level skills. I would dissent from that. I think the skills that a childcare needs, the human skills, are nothing short of extraordinary, and I think they should all be given medals every day of every week that they work. So the question there is, should we value what they do differently? Now, early childhood teachers earn a bit more. They earn $1,488 a week. So, about, quite a bit more than early childhood carers, because they have diplomas and they're more highly qualified. So let's look at another training, which is another job area, which is health and beauty salon assistants, another female-dominated one. And they are defined as performing routine tasks in hair salons. They earn on average $1,153 a week, which is $200 more than a childcare worker. Now let's go on to the male typical comparable jobs. They're not exactly the same, but I think they're comparable. Let's go on to building and plumbing labourers who need no qualifications at all. No Cert 3 training is required. Their average pay is $1,458, which is a lot higher than childcare workers. It's like 53% higher. Sure, there's labour involved in heavy labour, but childcare has its own physicality in changing nappies and restraining and managing very active and busy little children. Now, the average age, interestingly, of building and plumbing labourers is about the same as childcare workers. Then we go up the qualification chains to plumbers. They earn $1,894 a week, which is about over $400 more than an early childhood teacher with a diploma. Electricians are about the same. And so that there is a structural imbalance in compensation for, I would say, broadly equivalent work. And we're getting a very clear picture, I think, we do get a very clear picture that male-dominated jobs like the ones I've nominated with similar qualifications are paid a lot more than comparable female-dominated jobs. I know it's really important to have good plumbers and electricians, so we all have well-working plumbing systems and power supplies and working appliances that don't kill us. But are they really twice as valuable as childcare workers? And are hairdressing assistants worth 21% more pay than childcare workers? If so, why? I really think we have our values wrong. The danger of looking at childcare affordability without looking at value is you can get that sort of bean countery thing, and a 4.1% cumulative or compounded rate of increase in childcare is unsustainable for any normal family, and it cannot be allowed to happen. But while we are on the journey to affordable universal childcare, we have to think about the value of those workers. If we want high quality childcare, we have to pay commensurately, so we optimise the human capital, the carers, the human beings that every day look after our children and our grandchildren, because there is no way they don't do the most extraordinary job. If we're going to be deliver high performing childcare services, we have to pay these people more and recognise the gender inequity in comparative work. And I don't think that often happens. Often we compare like for like jobs. These are economic sectors which are very similar in terms of their contribution and their value to society, and possibly even different on the positive side to childcare workers, but they're not taken into consideration at all in formulating a fair and equitable system for human capital and workers.
Thank you, Lucy. Thank you very much. Can I now introduce Mohammed Al Kaavaji, who is Chief Executive Officer of the Federation of Ethnic Communities Council of Australia. It's the peak national body representing ethnic and multicultural communities in Australia. Mohammed was the first CEO of Welcome to Australia, and very much looking forward to his contribution. Thank you.
Thank you, Jay, and thanks everyone for having me today. Look, I'd like to start by acknowledging that I'm on the lands of the Kaurna people of the Adelaide Plains, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Look, I think, I mean, I'm here by no means, I'm no expert in early childhood education, but as a new parent of I've got an 11-month-old, still, I think he's still a baby. I've just learned my first lesson of, you know, what it feels like to have gastro in the house, and it was pretty nasty, and I'm still recovering. So my apologies if I'm not with it completely today. But look, I'd like to, I guess, I'm learning, and thank you to the previous speakers. I'm kind of learning about this early childhood education system. You know, I'm quite privileged that, you know, I kind of grew up here in Australia from the age of 13 since I arrived to Australia. So I kind of know the system, and kind of, I've got the language skills and whatnot to find my way around some of these complexities, if you like. But if you put yourself in the shoes of, you know, a vulnerable kind of, you know, newly arrived refugee family, and you trying to navigate everything from, you know, schooling to childcare to, you know, trying to work, and with some of the restrictions and some of the things that the government kind of imposes on you to try and integrate, and you must give back, and, you know, all those things, and the obsession with sending migrant communities to regional centres. I think we need to ask the question of how sustainable it is to, I guess, find let's say, you know, Arabic-speaking childcare centres, for example, everywhere. So that's really the niche. Childcare centres are not really the solution if we're trying to make sure that the solution is mainstream and it reaches everyone and provides the services that we need to everyone. So we really need to make sure that I guess the staff, the early educators, know about the cultural and religious aspect that are so important to some families, and I guess respect them, which I'm sure they are, and they're fantastic. I mean, the childcare centre that my son goes to are fantastic, and Lucy mentioned the importance of, you know, the churn rate, or the, you know, how long some of these people have been there. Our childcare centre, some of those people have been there for 15 years, and I'm starting to realise how rare that is, and, you know, what a blessing it is to kind of have that amazing service. So I think we just need to think about some of the complexities. So obviously, this is an issue about access and equity for migrant and refugee communities, and I think you know, the issues of I guess, how do we make sure that we communicate and actually make sure that the families and the parents know what their options are. And you know, for example, Georgie talked about the fees. I mean, for someone, as you know, as she mentioned, you know, as a well-educated white person, you know, the fees question was quite a bit of a mystery to her. So you can imagine what that would be for newly arrived refugee families who are just, you know, I guess partly don't have childcare as part of our culture, if you like. We don't really have, you know, childcare. We have kindergarten and onwards, but then, you know, you add the complexities of fees, and you have to pay for education and whatnot. The option of going to childcare is not an option, and I guess we really need to think about. And I guess the system really assumes that there is a parent available all the time at home who is not working to be able to do the drop-offs and the pickups, even during kindy hours. And to be honest, I have to say that I don't know much about this area, and or I guess the cold and the multicultural sector, because there hasn't been a significant comprehensive consultation on this issue. And I think this is the right time for us to be having that conversation. And I guess, you know, when when I give advice to government policy makers or politicians, I keep saying that, design a system for the most vulnerable members of our community. A refugee mother who is a refugee single mother with a son with disability and 5 other children ranging from ages. Design that system for those people, and you'll make sure that everybody else is covered in that system.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Mohammed. And so now we move into the next phase, which is just some Q&A from the audience. Then after that, we'll be having a short break and then heading into our breakout roundtables. But the first question that I'll invite is from Craig Emerson. Craig is, of course, the chairperson of the McKell Institute, with whom we're bringing this event to you. So it's a great pleasure to be working together with you once again, Craig. And you kick us off with our first question.
Well, thanks very much. And I was obviously thought that all the presentations were amazing and showed a lot of depth of understanding and appreciation of the challenges here. Georgie's presentation was a real life experience of what we call a workforce disincentive rate. That is that women, mothers, all up and down the income scale, including high up the income scale, can lose for the family budget anywhere between 75 and 120% of the earnings they make on an extra day's work. And blokes on the top marginal tax rate of 47% say, gee, that's high. Yet we have a society that says, oh yeah, but for mothers, anywhere between 75 and 120% is okay. So it's partly a comment, but I just don't understand how we got to a societal view that it's okay to penalise women for having babies and doing unpaid work in having the babies and trying to return to the workforce and basically putting up a big stop sign and say, no, we don't want you back there. Has anyone got and it's not a political thing, this is more a societal thing. How do we end up with such perverse incentives that we have almost systematically, very aggressively discouraged mothers from returning to work or increasing their days of work beyond 3 per week?
Thanks, Craig. Great question. Georgie, you want to have a crack at that?
Yeah, I did actually, which probably won't surprise anyone if you've ever heard anything I've said before. But Craig, I think it's a really good point, and I think that it is pretty uncomfortable to think about this. But one of the sad realities is that we are actually still a very sexist country. We routinely treat women almost with disdain for earning an income. I mean, one of the only, obviously, after the last election, the opposition leader put forward a plan for working towards universal access to high quality early education and care. And the argument in response that is stuck is that it would benefit women on higher income the most. And we are so uncomfortable with women earning money, ultimately. And I know lots of people will say, oh, no, that's ridiculous. But if you look at all of the settings that we have in our policies and workplaces, we consider women earning money to be a luxury that can be tolerated if they can do it between if they can still maintain their caring responsibilities. And it's incredibly demoralizing. And I mean, I have said this to people quite seriously. If a country like Australia is going to invest as much money as we do in the education at a secondary and tertiary level that we educate women, why don't we just stop doing that? If we're not going to create the policy settings and infrastructure that enable women to use the skills and education that they have, why do we waste the money educating them? Well,
it's a very good question, because 57% of university graduates each year are women. So one part of society's collective mind says, this is great. go out there, you know, with these skills and, you know, express them and create, you know, prosperity and happiness and everything. And the other half of society's mind, the same mind, says, but if you do, we'll really penalise you very, very hard. I just am astonished how this
also
tends to evolve this way.
I'll just say one final thing and then I'll let the other speakers come in. But I think what is incredibly telling, and chances are you've heard this before or read it before, but the World Economic Forum publishes an annual global gender gap report. And it began in 2006. And every year since then, Australia has held the #1 spot for educational attainment for women and girls. So there's no country in the world that does a better job of female education than us. Our female workforce participation rate is 53. And that says everything in my mind. And the reason for that gap is because we have not invested in the kinds of infrastructure that also create the social change that support women to work. And one of the critical pieces of infrastructure is affordable, high quality childcare that normalises working and caring.
And I'll finish 15 seconds, Jay, and then I'll stop. We have universal Medicare, right? It's universally available. James Packer can walk into a doctor, get out his Medicare card, walk out, no fees whatsoever. NDIS is universal. By the way, so is university education, it's universal. And then we come to the childcare subsidy and we say, oh no, that can't be universal. So I'll leave it at that.
Does anyone, Lucy, did you want to
yeah, I would say, thank you, Jay. I would say one of the, you know, extreme anomalies is that why is, you know, education from 5 up, you know, primary and high school education, absolutely free.
Exactly.
And early childhood education is not free. It just doesn't make any sense. And I think, you know, I think that it's a big anomaly in our system, and it's having the effects that Georgie was talking about: very low participation rate and underutilization of enormous human talent, being highly qualified women. And it's, you know, it's just like effective marginal tax rates. It is crazy, and rational people, rational women would not stay in the workforce if they were just looking in pure fiscal terms while they have young children. But they do because they're determined to keep going. But they are bearing the price of this, and and if they step out of the workforce, they're bearing the cost of career delay or impairment. So whatever way it cuts in terms of productivity loss on the part of adults, it's preponderantly borne by women, and it's so unfair.
Thank you, Lucy. Look, just to get into this question a bit more deeply about early educators and why they're paid less than other professionals. Soccer Pawson, I think, has a question. Soccer, would you be able to ask the question you've got, and perhaps I'll get Michelle to have a crack at answering it. No, do we have? Is Soccer there? If not, I can ask the question on her behalf. Anyway, it's sorry, you there?
Hi. Look, thank you so much. I love to ask the question. We know that early childhood.
Looks like we're having a bit of a problem with your internet there, Soccer. So I might have a go at asking your question on your behalf.
Yes. So. Sorry, and you know, how are you going to communicate with our leader to let them understand that this is need to be changed, and early childhood educators need to be more recognized?
For just Michelle, in case you missed the first part of that, it's basically goes to this fundamental question about why early childhood educators are paid so much less than similar professions. Just on mute there, Michelle.
Thanks, Jay, and thanks, Soccer. Look, responding to Soccer's question as well as Craig's, I mean, I think a fundamental issue here is how we undervalue both the work done by women and work that's seen as caring work. So early childhood educating and care is one really stark example of that we as a society, I think, because it is work that was traditionally done by women and traditionally done by women as unpaid work, that now that it is work that is still done predominantly by women, but in a formal paid sector and in employment, we still grossly undervalue it, and there's a latent view that somehow this type of work is less important, and therefore we don't properly recognise it, and we don't properly pay for it, and I think that the fact that we have many millions of dollars that actually go from taxpayers into this sector, but we don't tie that money to what's paid to the workers in the sector. So there's plenty of people making good money out of providing childcare and early childhood educating, but we don't think equitably about how to ensure that the people who are actually doing the really hard, important work that we rely on so much, like it really, I just can't think of anything that we add such a degree of responsibility to. What other job, you know, really do we let our most vulnerable, I mean, somebody did mention aged care, and I think that is another good example that at both ends of life, we have these jobs predominantly done by women that are done by workers who the majority of are in casual or part-time or insecure work, and grossly underpaid. And so it is about how do we reevaluate how important that job is, how important the skill is, how we recognise it, and how that recognition must lead to both a greater recognition in terms of pay, but also security, because this notion that people have to do multiple jobs or not stay in the sector they love because they literally can't meet their own needs, of course, is damaging to them, but it also is damaging to the quality of education and care, because if you have a high turnover because the workers in the sector can't afford to stay in it, then of course the other people who suffer from that is our children and their future. So I think it is about a fundamental reevaluation of the importance of this work and what we pay for it.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Michelle, and thank you. I know there are a bunch of other questions that are still in the chat, and we sort of encourage you to participate in a dialogue within the chat. And I know that a few little strands are occurring around this, including some excellent conversations around what do we really mean by universal or cheap or free, and also some great discussions about really the convenience, I suppose, of preschool and the wraparound childcare arrangements in the current system. So I encourage you to keep that dialogue up. You'll have an opportunity to explore some of these ideas in the breakout roundtable discussions. So we are now at that point where we are going to have a short 10-minute break. And for those of you in Western Australia, that means coming back at breakfast time. No, sorry, at 12 noon. For those of you in New South Wales, Victoria, Tassie and ACT, be back at 3 p.m. For those in South Australia, just because we used to like to be different in South Australia, we're back at 2:30. And for those of you in the Northern Territory, inexplicably, you'll be back at 1:30. So it's a very wide nation, that's all I can say. So yeah, 10 minutes, go and make yourself a cup of tea and make sure you come back. And what will happen when you come back is that basically we're going to move you into breakout roundtables for discussions. And we'll talk about that at that time, but there'll be 4 breakout roundtable rooms and you can choose which room you'd like to be part of. And I'll talk to you about that when we come back. So make sure you're back in 10 minutes time. Lovely, thank you. See you in a bit.